I'm quite astonished that a military figure like him could suggest that as though that was a favourable scenario, because, you know, people forget that in 1948, 1949, Berlin went under a blockade by the Soviet Union. You know, the West literally had to fly in food and water to keep the population going. So that is not an ideal scenario.
I'm joined now by the Sunday Times Deputy Political Editor, Harry Yorke, for analysis on the key political stories. And top of the bill, I think, Harry, has got to be this decision on the future of steel production in the UK and what's been going on at Scunthorpe.
Absolutely, Rod. I mean, this is a big day. We've had an extraordinary decision taken by the Prime Minister yesterday. He has decided to recall Parliament on a Saturday. Now, that hasn't happened since the Afghan crisis of 2021. So it's a big moment, and MPs will be literally in a matter of minutes. In fact, they're actually in the chamber now, starting to debate an emergency piece of legislation. And this legislation, in effect, is, whilst the government doesn't want to say this yet, it is basically paving the way for the state to take British Steel back into public ownership. There are other options on the table, but that seems the most viable. And now what the bill itself will do when passed is it basically gives the Secretary of State for Business, Jonathan Reynolds, the ability to take control of the steel plant in Scunthorpe, where the blast furnaces are. He'll take complete control over them, and he'll be able to direct what they can do. Now, the reason why that is critical and why the government have had to do that today is because those blast furnaces were at risk of basically going out. And once they go out, they cannot be switched back on. In other words, the Scunthorpe steel furnaces would die at that point. So this is why the government's doing it. And once that bill has passed, they will be able to get the raw materials that they need to keep the furnaces going into the Scunthorpe plants, and then that will buy them some time to work out what comes next. And given that the commercial negotiations with the Chinese owner Jingye have clearly broken down, you would imagine there's just basically one of two options. The state either takes the steel plants into full public ownership, full nationalisation, or they try and find another commercial partner to come in, maybe 50-50, 25-75 with the state. But either way, it's a very big moment.
It is a big moment and an enormous change in kind of approach to steel, because I remember the closure of steelworks in Redcar up where I'm from. There was no appetite either in the Labour Party or indeed the Conservative Party to keep those steelworks open. And I was also interested in the fact that Liam Byrne and others have been stressing that this is a national security decision as well as one about obviously protecting jobs and trade. That is a change in tone, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but it also is reflecting reality, Rod. So we have, as you say, we have allowed the steel industry in the UK to die. The steel industry in this country has basically declined because they cannot compete with the rest of the world. We have a situation where China is flooding the global markets with incredibly cheap produced steel. And then back here in the UK, what's happened is our industrial electricity prices are so expensive. I think comparatively, they're about 4 times more expensive than US manufacturers. So they just can't compete. They can't compete on price and they can't compete on production. So we've seen this decline. Now, the reason why Scunthorpe matters is because the moment that Scunthorpe dies, the UK loses the sovereign capability to produce what's known as virgin steel. And that is a very, very important commodity to the UK because we build a huge amount of our rail network using that steel. It's also used in defence. For example, HS2 as well. Cars, JCB and Caterpillar, they all use that. And the reality is that we lose that capability in the UK. Where are we likely to end up buying that from? The answer is likely China. And
China, yes.
and so in a world which is increasingly heating up, when you have potentially an access of Iran, China, Russia, and people in the UK government in America are starting to think about, I hate to say this, but it's true, a pre-war scenario. You don't really want to be in a situation where key things like steel can't be made in your own countries. I
wonder if that dewy-eyed idea of globalisation, which allowed us to give or to go into partnership with the Chinese in making such a fundamental and important commodity as steel is being rethought a little bit in their minds. Anyway, I suppose we should move on because General Keith Kellogg had an exclusive interview with the Times, a somewhat interesting statement that Ukraine could be divided along the same lines as Berlin. That's cheered everybody up.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure who it's cheered up, actually, Ron. If I was in Ukraine reading that, I'd be pretty concerned. I mean,
yeah, indeed.
I think James Heal, speaking earlier on the programme, put it quite well when he said it's quite astonishing levels of ignorance on display here from senior figures around Trump. We've got to remember, Keith Kellogg is the envoy to the president to Ukraine. He is the guy that's supposed to be overseeing efforts to secure a ceasefire and a permanent peace deal. Now, I'm sure some of your listeners will be able to think back to the period of the Cold War, but certainly there'll be many East Germans who don't look back fondly on the period when Berlin was carved up between the powers, and you had, for example, it just... The problem with what Kellogg said, I'm quite astonished that a military figure like him could suggest that as though that was a favourable scenario, because, people forget that in 1948, 1949, Berlin went under a blockade by the Soviet Union. The West literally had to fly in food and water to keep the population going. So that is not an ideal scenario. And I also just think that whilst, I guess, reading this from a UK perspective, it's probably welcome that the Americans are now talking about the potential for troops on the ground, because originally they were very dismissive of this idea of a peacekeeping force. Yeah. So the fact that they're talking about a reassurance force and Kellogg's talking about French in the UK, I guess that's a positive. The problem with all of this, though, ultimately, despite the fact we've been talking about it for 2 months, is that when you actually look at the Russian position on all of this, it remains categorical, which is that Russia still does not accept and will not accept under any condition NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, whether they're peacekeeping or otherwise. So until the Russians shift their position, it's very, very hard to see how all of this is going to work.
It is, isn't it? I ought to mention that Kellogg has later said that he thinks he was misquoted by the Times, but I've read what he said, and he seems to have said what he said. It's incredibly tin-eared. I think that's the least you can say. But let's move on from Ukraine to America and the various tariffs. The UK officials are going to be talking to Trump's administration to hash out some sort of economic deal. What do you think we're going to get?
Well, that is very hard to know at this moment, Rod. So, it almost feels like a distant memory, doesn't it? So much news has happened in the last few hours. But, we forget that only a few days ago, the president, after sending the global markets into kind of financial meltdown, has kind of pulled back a little bit and paused his retaliatory tariffs. But the problem for the UK is that whilst other countries that had much higher tariffs imposed have seen theirs come down to 10%, we still have a base. Ours hasn't changed. It's still 10% baseline, and then 25% tariffs on steel and cars. So the UK government's got a dilemma there. It's in a way, it's lost its tariff differential advantage that it had over the EU. So
yes.
So this is why we're seeing a renewed focus on this trade deal. It's something that the UK desperately hopes to achieve, because they hope that they could see those tariffs reduced to zero or even reduced a bit further. Now, the slight problem with that is that certainly from the kind of pronouncements of certain key advisors to Donald Trump, it seems the president is very keen that tariffs exist universally on a baseline level. In other words, those 10% tariffs, they want to keep them. And so earlier this week, Kevin Hassett, who is a key economic advisor to Trump, said it would take a, quote, extraordinary deal to get this across the line. And the question is, what does extraordinary look like to a transactional president like Trump? Is he going to demand, as has been widely suggested, that we have to change some of our laws, like the Online Safety Act? Will he demand that we scrap the digital service tax on the kind of tech giants like Facebook and X, which was obviously owned by people who are very invested in Donald Trump over in America? And will he look at things like the issue around food standards? Now, these are all undetermined questions, and all very politically difficult ones for a Labour government. So the balancing act that Sir Keir Starmer has to now pursue is how much of an economic hit do those 10% tariffs mean for the UK, and are they worth getting rid of? And what's the cost of that? Is it, to do all those things, what political capital is he prepared to expend by doing unpopular things to appease Trump? And until we get clarity on that, I'm not quite sure where this is going to head.
And moving on, the UK and Europe, there seems to be a bit of a divide now between the UK and the EU over Ukraine. John Healey, Defence Secretary, has expressed a degree of frustration at the EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, for saying that the Anglo-French-led coalition have no clear plans to secure a post-war peace settlement in Ukraine. What's going on here?
Well, I think this is reading between the lines here, Rod. I would suggest that this is a classic example of when the European Union or the Commission is slightly cut out of something, when member states or allies are acting without the full involvement of the European Union, and it doesn't like it. So Kaja Kallas is the EU's foreign affairs chief, but she's also a former Prime Minister of Estonia, right? So there's two things. There is a sense in Europe that whilst Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer are pressing ahead with these plans, some of the Baltic states are quite worried about whether it goes far enough, because they're worried about their futures, because they're most exposed to Russia. And then within the actual EU itself, there is a divergence of opinion amongst member states about whether sending troops to Ukraine is a step too far. For example, we know that Olaf Scholz, the outgoing German Chancellor, he was very, very, very annoyed about this proposal when Emmanuel Macron first put it on the table in Paris earlier this year. So what I think she is reflecting is that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a disagreements, but I think she's probably being a bit unfair to suggest these plans aren't advancing. I know from my own conversations that they are, and I think that's why you've seen the Defence Secretary, John Healey, come out and make very clear they are advancing and they're detailed, and he made the point of saying the EU is not involved in planning for this. But to answer your question, I think she's probably said it because the EU is quite annoyed that they're not at the centre of all of this.
Yeah, indeed. And finally, on politics this week, Nigel Farage has turned his cannons on Kemi Badenoch. Essentially, was totally disingenuous after it has emerged that she supported several diversity proposals while in government. It's got quite nasty between them, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. And this story, I would suggest, is a classic pre-local elections spat between the Reform Party and the Conservatives. I mean, Farage is trying to take basically what many people would consider to be Badenoch's strongest qualities, which is her experience and background in the equalities brief when she was the equalities minister, and try and turn it against her to make it seem as though she's something of a fraud. I have to say, objectively speaking, if you look at actually her history, we have to remember that Badenoch, she was the minister that oversaw Sir Tony Sewell's race disparities review, which seems like a distant memory now, but under Boris Johnson, that was a review that came out and said basically Britain isn't institutionally racist, and it was an incredibly controversial report. There was a huge row between left and right over it, but actually that report was probably very much the kind of thing that Nigel Farage would have liked. So she did that. She also was an incredibly active minister when it came to trying to block the use of puberty blockers in the NHS, for example, and scrutinising the work of the GIDS Tavistock clinic. So look, this is politics in play. I think clearly Kemi Badenoch as Equalities Minister did advance some some policies in this area because that was literally her job. But I think if you look at it in the round, I'm not sure this one's going to stick so much.
No, I suspect you're right. Brilliant stuff, Harry. Thanks ever so much. And you can read more from the Sunday Times Deputy Political Editor, Harry Yorke, in the paper tomorrow or with a digital subscription via thetimes.com.